The air in the Incheon Nano-Plant didn't smell like air. It smelled like ozone and expensive filtration. Kelechi, the precision Okoro, stood over the Litho 7 assembly, her digital calipers catching the overhead LED glare. Clothed in oil-stained, oversized overalls, a passing executive might have mistaken her for a janitor or low-level maintenance. They would be wrong. Kelechi didn't just turn wrenches, she calculated the souls of machines. Behind her grease-smudged forehead sat a Master of Science in Engineering, MSc Eng, a degree she used not for a corporate paycheck, but as a weapon of logic. She considered herself an artisan, a millwright who understood that a billion-dollar empire could be brought down by a single loose bolt. It was a family tradition. Kelechi served the sole syndicate just as her mother had before her, moving through the underworld like a ghost in the gears. To the syndicate's upper echelon, she was a mythic figure known only as the Precision. She was their ghost architect, the person who made problems disappear quietly, exactly, and without a trace. For now, she wasn't looking at the machine. She was looking at the digital readout of the ambient temperature, 21.4 degrees Celsius. "It's too hot," she said, her voice a low melodic rasp that cut through the hum of the clean room. Behind her, 3 men in charcoal suits, cleaners for the Seoul Mafia Syndicate, entered and heaved a heavy industrial-grade plastic drum toward the primary acid vat. The drum didn't contain chemicals. It contained the mortal remains of a man who had talked too much to the Interpol. "Keep moving, engineer," the lead cleaner grunted, his hand resting near the bulge of a silenced Glock. "The chairman wants this ghosted before the morning shift." The mafia boss was only referred to by his surname, Kang, but he preferred to be called the chairman. Kelechi didn't flinch. She adjusted the metallic threaded gele wrapped tightly around her head, the bronze fabric shimmering like a circuit board. She stepped in front of the vat, blocking their path with a wrench that looked more like a scepter. "If you drop him now, you'll be scrubbing his DNA off the floor for a week," she stated calmly. "The thermal expansion on the vat's intake valve has exceeded its 0.02 millimeter tolerance. At this temperature, the hydrochloric acid won't circulate. It'll flash boil and spray the entire room. You'll dissolve along with your problem." The cleaners froze. They knew how to kill, but they didn't understand the physics of a botched disposal. They looked at the vat, then back at the woman who treated a $1 million semiconductor plant like her personal kitchen. Kelechi checked her stopwatch. "Wait precisely 90 seconds for the coolant to cycle. Or don't. I've already calculated the splash radius. I'll be behind the lead shielding." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the cooling fans. In that moment, the hierarchy shifted. The men with guns were suddenly subservient to the woman with the measurements. They waited, eyes glued to the digital clock on her wrist. As the countdown hit 0, Kelechi stepped aside. "Proceed. When you go back, tell the chairman that the Litho 7 is calibrated, but also tell him that you, his cleaners," she gestured towards them, "are sloppy. You don't know how to work with tolerances." She watched the drum tip, her face a mask of cold, mechanical indifference. She didn't fear the monsters. She simply knew how to maintain them. "The machine is running, but the pressure is building. Can Kelechi keep the syndicate from redlining? Hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next calibration." The elevator to the chairman's penthouse didn't hum. It vibrated at a precise 12.5 hertz. Most people felt the luxury, the gold leaf paneling and the scent of sandalwood. Kelechi felt the misalignment in the traction sheaves. She stood perfectly still, her grease-stained coveralls a stark contrast to the velvet interior, her fingers tracing the digital caliper on her hip like a talisman. When the doors slid open, she wasn't met with a desk. She was met with a panoramic view of the Seoul skyline, sliced into sections by reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass. Chairman Kang sat at a low black obsidian table, surrounded by 3 stone-faced advisors. On the table lay a single antiquated circuit board and a handful of raw, unrefined coltan. "You're late, Engineer Okoro," Kang said, his voice as dry as parchment. "The elevator was out of alignment by about 0.15 millimeters," Kelechi replied, stepping onto the silk rug without an ounce of hesitation. "And I had to recalibrate the floor sensor so we wouldn't over-travel and snap the cable. You're welcome." The advisors shifted, hands moving toward their lapels. Kang raised a hand, a thin smile ghosting his lips. "Precision is your religion, I see. Good, because my empire is starting to rattle." He pushed the circuit board toward her. It was a Lagos-manufactured relay, the kind used in the massive undersea data cables that connected the African continent to the global cloud. It had been melted from the inside out. "This was recovered from a hub in the Gulf of Guinea," Kang explained. 3 of our mining refineries in Nigeria went dark 10 minutes after this fried. My experts say it was a power surge. What do you say?" Kelechi didn't pick up the board. She leaned over it, her eyes scanning the heat stress patterns on the copper traces. She saw the ghosting around the capacitors, a specific signature of intentional, harmonic interference. "It wasn't a surge," she stated. "It was a resonant frequency attack. Someone injected a high-frequency vibration into the data stream. They didn't break the door down. They hummed until the hinges melted." She looked directly into Kang's cold, obsidian eyes. "The sabotage is coming from within your own supply chain, Chairman. Your Lagos pipeline isn't leaking, it's being harvested. And the only person who can track the frequency should be someone who knows exactly how to listen." "You fit that picture perfectly." Kang leaned back, the city lights reflecting in his glasses. "Then you leave for Lagos tonight. You aren't just a mechanic anymore, Kelechi. You are my auditor." Kelechi felt the weight of the assignment. This wasn't just fixing machines anymore. It was fixing a war. The audit had only just begun. The Murtala Muhammad International Airport didn't welcome Kelechi with open arms. It hit her with a wall of 34 degrees C heat and 85% humidity. To anyone else, the Lagos terminal was a chaotic swarm of shouting voices and honking yellow Danfo buses. To Kelechi, it was a complex thermodynamic system struggling to maintain equilibrium. She wasn't met by a driver. She was met by 4 black SUVs that cut through the traffic like sharks through silt. "Chairman Kang's auditor?" a man in a sweat-stained linen suit asked, his hand hovering near his waistband. He didn't wait for an answer before ushering her into the lead vehicle. 10 minutes into the drive, the audit turned into an ambush. As they entered the Apapa container terminal, a labyrinth of stacked, rusted steel, the lead SUV slammed its brakes. A massive gantry crane, hacked and screaming, dropped a 20-ton shipping container directly onto the road ahead. Metal shrieked against asphalt. "Ambush!" the driver yelled, drawing a weapon. Kelechi didn't reach for a gun. She quickly scanned outside, and her eyes settled on the shipping containers. "That's it," she thought quickly. She instantly reached for her portable frequency generator and yanked it out of its carry case. Through the reinforced glass, she saw the rival militia, the brass serpents, emerging from the shadows of the towering steel stacks. They were armed with high-caliber rifles, ready to turn the SUV into a colander. "Stay in the car," the guard barked. "If I stay in this car, we are a static target," Kelechi said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, mechanical calm. "Physics doesn't care about your bravery." She flung the door open and rolled into the narrow gap between two stacks of containers with her portable frequency generator. This one was battery-operated and had been retrofitted. Its original purpose was for testing, troubleshooting, and calibrating electronic circuits, but it was now equipped with a handheld probe used to vibrate sand beds with the efficiency of much bigger machines in geotechnical engineering and material testing that she was expecting to be involved in on this trip. She didn't run for cover. She ran for the base of the nearest stack, 6 high, leaning slightly due to the uneven coastal soil. She pressed the probe against the corner casting of the bottom container. At the same time, she dialed her frequency generator to 8.4 Hz, the resonant frequency of an hollow steel box under tension or shipping container. She started the frequency generator. The vibration was subtle at first, a deep hum that rattled the teeth of the approaching gunman. Then the stack began to dance. The microscopic gaps between the containers expanded. "What is that noise?" one of the serpents screamed, pausing to look up. "It's the sound of a structural failure," Kelechi whispered to herself. With a final targeted burst of vibration, the stack hit its resonant frequency, and 500 tons of steel began to vibrate and slide with the grace of a falling mountain. The containers didn't just fall, they cascaded, creating a wall of impenetrable steel with the brass serpents on the other side. By the time the dust settled and the echo stopped ringing, the path was blocked, the enemy was pinned. Kelechi's escort team rapidly backed their vehicles before the brass serpents could regroup, and they escaped through an alternative route. The Lagos shoreline faded into a hazy line of orange gas flares as the Syndicate's private submersible descended into the Gulf of Guinea. Kelechi sat in the cramped, pressurized cabin, her eyes fixed on a thermal imaging tablet. Most engineers would be marveling at the bioluminescent life outside that started as the submersible dropped below 200 meters depth. But she was focused on the tablet screen, displaying the heat dissipation of 1 million high-end AI chips submerged in a facility in the Atlantic's cold embrace. "The hidden server farm is at 400 meters, the pilot muttered, his voice tight with nerves. "Chairman Kang says it's the most secure data hub in the world. Salt water is the perfect coolant." "Salt water is a perfect corrosive," Kelechi corrected, not looking up. "And at that depth, the pressure is 41 atmospheres, or 41 bars. One hairline fracture in the cooling jacket, and your secure hub becomes an expensive aquarium." Slowly, the dune came into view like a ghost out of the darkness. The massive, barnacle-encrusted titanium pods of the Benin node. This facility ran autonomously using AI, low-level robotics, and Internet of Things, IoT, to operate, optimize, and adapt to changes in real time with minimal, or in most cases no, human intervention. As the submersible's light swept over it, Kelechi saw the anomaly. The exterior of the third pod wasn't a dull gray. It was glowing a faint, sickly cherry red through the thermal lens, showing high temperatures inside, despite being cooled by the cold, dark Atlantic Ocean. "Let's dock at Pod 3, she commanded. "Now." Inside the server pod, the air was a suffocating wall of dry electric heat. The hum wasn't the steady purr of a well-oiled machine. It was a frantic, high-pitched scream. Once inside, Kelechi stepped onto the grated floor, her boots clicking against metal that felt uncomfortably warm. She opened the primary diagnostic panel. The readout was a sea of crimson warnings. Core temp, 178 degrees Celsius. This was the temperature in the Pod 3 AI computing cluster, housed in a separate section of Pod 3. "It's redlining," the pilot gasped, wiping sweat from his eyes. "The pumps must be down." This was way higher than the maximum rated safe junction temperature of 95 degrees Celsius to 105 degrees Celsius, or 203 degrees Fahrenheit to 221 degrees Fahrenheit, Kelechi said offhandedly. By this time, the chips have automatically throttled performance to prevent permanent hardware damage. She didn't look at the pumps. She looked at the code scrolling across the terminal. She saw a tiny repetitive loop, a phantom instruction that was forcing the processors to perform millions of useless calculations per second. It was a digital fever, intentionally induced. "The pumps are fine," Kelechi said finally, her jaw tightening. "Someone is overclocking the entire node from a remote terminal. They're using override codes to keep the processors in the endless loop and stop the system from stabilizing it. They're trying to trigger a thermal runaway." "Why?" the pilot muttered. "Because," Kelechi spoke under her breath as her eyes darted over the alarms and flashing lights, "the AI chips in this facility are soldered to their printed circuit boards and not plugged into sockets like elsewhere. And at 180 degrees Celsius, the solder joining the chips to the printed circuit boards," she paused, "starts melting, and the chips, assuming they're still working by that temperature, which they shouldn't be, will just start falling off the printed circuit boards, ensuring permanent damage. The chips fail, and the Syndicate's global logistics grid goes dark. It's not a hardware failure, it's a digital arson." She realized then that the Syndicate wasn't just losing money, they were being systematically blinded. As she reached for her override key, a secondary alarm began to wail. The pod's internal pressure was rising. The seawater outside was no longer cooling the pod, it was being turned into steam. Judging by the readings of the rate of temperature rise, Kelechi knew she only had a few hours left to kill the fever before the entire pod turned into a deep-sea pressure cooker. She knew exactly where to start looking for answers. "Let's go," she said to the pilot as she headed for the docked submersible in long strides. "The heat is rising and the timer is ticking. Hit the subscribe button. The truth is deeper than you think."
Kelechi didn't go to a safe house. She went to a ghost house. In the heart of the Obalende district, tucked behind a shop selling salvaged alternator parts, stood a rusted corrugated shed. This used to be her mother's workshop, a place the Syndicate's high-tech drones had flagged as industrial scrap. But as Kelechi pressed her thumb against a hidden, grease-caked sensor in the doorframe, the magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. The air inside smelled of solder, ancient bronze, and the faint, lingering scent of hibiscus oil.
You always said the best place to hide a secret was in plain sight, Mama, Kelechi whispered, her boots clicking on the concrete floor. On the central workbench sat a massive, unfinished bronze casting of a Benin leopard. To any art collector, it would be a masterpiece. To Kelechi, it was just a mechanical housing. She ran her fingers along the leopard's flank, finding the microscopic seam, a 0.5 millimeter gap that only a millwright's eye could detect. She inserted her digital caliper into the seam and twisted. A section of the bronze slid back, revealing not clockwork, but a vintage 1990s server rack cooled by a silent, custom-built liquid nitrogen loop. This was the Benin Cipher, the original architecture of the Syndicate's entire untraceable shipping lane. Her mother hadn't just been an artisan, she was the ghost who had built the digital shadows that Chairman Kang now ruled. This old server was still connected to the Syndicate's high-tech servers. Kelechi plugged her tablet into the console. The code that scrolled across the screen wasn't just Python or C++, it was interleaved with Igbo linguistic patterns. A linguistic firewall, her mother had called it. Kelechi knew it well, but still her breath hitched. If you don't know the dialect, the logic in the code looks like gibberish. As she translated the first layer of the cipher, her blood turned to ice. The thermal fever in the deep-sea pod wasn't an outside attack. Someone had logged in remotely and entered the override codes and uploaded the code snippet that was keeping the processors running in an endless loop of useless calculations, inhibiting normal operation. Only 2 people in the Syndicate had access to the override codes, the chairman and 1 member of the board chosen by the chairman. The identity of that member was never revealed. Kelechi's fingers flew across the tablet. She wasn't looking for a name. Names could be forged. She was looking for a mechanical footprint. Every login to the deep-sea node required a handshake with the Syndicate's central logistics hub, the great gear that her mother had designed decades ago. "Show me the latency," Kelechi whispered. She pulled up the raw packet data from the moment the thermal runaway began. In a digital world, everything happens at the speed of light, but in a physical network, distance creates a tiny microscopic delay, latency. She noticed a 42-millisecond lag between the login command and the execution in the Gulf of Guinea. If the chairman had logged in from Seoul, the lag would be 180 milliseconds, she deduced, her eyes narrowing. This signal didn't cross the Pacific, it's local. She cross-referenced the lag with the Syndicate's private satellite pings. The signal had originated from a high-security relay in Victoria Island, Lagos. The secret board member wasn't in Korea. They were right here in Nigeria, overseeing the expansion. Kelechi dug deeper into the linguistic firewall. Her mother had hidden a secret audit log in the Igbo interleaved code, a subroutine that recorded the hardware ID of any device that accessed the override protocols. The ID flashed on her screen, MAC ID 00.1A.2B.3C.4D.5E. I've seen that machine before, Kelechi realized. A memory clicked into place. A week ago, at the Incheon plant, she had been recalibrating a Litho 7 assembly when a high-ranking official had brushed past her, his specialized, encrypted tablet briefly syncing with the plant's local Wi-Fi. As a millwright, she noticed the hardware the way others noticed a face. It was a custom-built, titanium-cased rugged tablet, the only one of its kind in the Syndicate's inventory. It belonged to Jin Ho, the lead logistics officer. The logic was undeniable. The chairman would never sabotage his own multi-billion-dollar node. That left the secret board member. Only one person had the motive to disrupt the internet while being physically present in Lagos to coordinate the iron market barons. the man who controlled the flow of every crate and every bite. Jin Ho isn't just a logistics officer. He's the chairman's secret board member, and he just tried to burn down his own house. She disconnected the tablet. The Benin Cipher had given her the who and the where. Now she needed the why. She stood up. The metallic threaded delay on her head caught the dim light of the workshop. She didn't need the Syndicate's guards anymore. She needed the people who lived in the shadows. The audit has moved from the machine to the man.
The Victoria Island cable landing station was a cathedral of concrete and cooling fans, the place where the literal nerves of the world's internet emerged from the Atlantic. Kelechi stood on the gantry, watching the Syndicate's board of directors, 6 men in suits that cost more than the turbines in the cooling plant, approach her. Engineer Okoro, the eldest, Director Clark said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "We've reviewed your report on the fever in Pod 3. Your services are no longer required. We've brought in a team from Seoul to finalize the calibration." Kelechi didn't move. She was holding a heavy industrial wrench, her gele tied with a sharp, aggressive precision. "Your team will kill the node in under an hour. They're looking at the software. They aren't looking at the structural fatigue of the cooling jackets to the prolonged elevated temperatures the jackets have been working at. We don't pay you for your opinions on our personnel," Park snapped. "Hand over the access codes to the Benin Cipher and leave, now." Kelechi smiled, a cold, mechanical expression. "My time is up, right? I already knew you'd try to decommission me. Logic dictates that when a part becomes too efficient, the rest of the machine tries to grind it down. But you forgot one thing. I'm the one who installed these cooling pumps." She pointed with her wrench to the 2 massive pumps humming away on an elevated steel platform attached to the building structure. As the board members signaled their security team, Kelechi didn't run. She struck the main coolant pipe with her wrench, a precise, calculated blow. The sound wasn't a crash, it was a high-pitched metallic ping. "What was that?" Park demanded, pausing as the room began to vibrate. "That," Kelechi said, stepping back toward the emergency exit, was the sound of an approaching resonant fracture. I've spent the last 20 minutes adjusting the pump speed to almost match the natural frequency of this floor's support struts. Quick lesson in physics, Director. That knock from my wrench acted as the sudden energy transfer needed to cause the pipes and floor struts to reach their natural resonant frequency. The vibration will tear the bolts right out of the foundation." The room began to groan, a deep, sub-bass rumble that made the director's teeth ache. Dust fell from the ceiling. The security team stumbled, their aim spoiled by the literal shaking of the earth beneath them. "You're insane!" Park screamed over the rising roar of the machinery. "No," Kelechi shouted back, her hand on the exit lever. "I'm just working within the tolerances. You wanted me gone? Fine, but the machine goes with me." She exited and slammed the door shut, the magnetic lock engaging just as the first overhead light fixture shattered against the concrete floor. She was an outsider, a woman in a man's war, but she had just proven that in a world made of steel, the person who understands the vibration and the tolerances holds all the power. The interrogation didn't happen in a neon-lit warehouse or a damp basement. It happened inside a decommissioned hyperbaric welding chamber at the edge of a skeletal, abandoned Lagos shipyard. Salt-heavy wind whistled through the rusted girders outside, but inside the control booth, the atmosphere was clinical and quiet. Kelechi stood outside the thick, armored porthole glass of the steel sphere, her hand resting on the brass manual bypass valve. Inside the chamber, strapped to a reinforced steel chair, was Jin Ho, the Syndicate's lead logistics officer and the man who had authorized the hit on her life. Extracting a man of Jin Ho's stature should have been impossible. He moved with a 12-man security detail and the best counter-surveillance tech money could buy. But Kelechi hadn't used the Syndicate's resources. She had reached into her mother's unspoken ledger, contacting the iron market barons, the unseen hands of the Lagos underworld, who still remembered the favors her mother had performed when their own machinery or their lives were failing. She hadn't asked how they bypassed his guards. She didn't want to know. She only watched as they delivered the traitor, bound and gagged, into the shipyard's chamber, secured him to the chair, removed the gag, then closed the chamber's heavy, airtight door as if it was just a casual walk in the park. The debts owed to the mother are paid to the daughter, the leader of the extraction team whispered, his shadow long against the bulkhead. If there is nothing else you need, then we were never here. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect reserved for royalty or the highest tier fixers, and vanished with his team into the humid night. Kelechi watched them leave, then turned her full attention to the glass. She flipped the toggle on the intercom. The air in there is currently at 14.7 psi, Kelechi said, her voice a calm, mechanical rasp. Standard atmospheric pressure. You feel fine, your lungs are at equilibrium. But you're an expert in logistics, Jin Ho. You know that a system only works when the pressure is balanced. Jin Ho spat at the glass, his eyes wild. You're a grease monkey, Okoro. You don't know what you are dealing with. You think your mother's ghosts can protect you? You don't have the stomach for this. Kelechi didn't answer with words. She turned the brass valve precisely 1/4 turn. The hiss of compressed air filling the chamber sounded like a hungry predator. At 30 psi, your ears will start to pop. At 60 psi, the nitrogen in your blood will start to act like a narcotic. It's called the rapture of the deep. You'll feel happy, Jin Ho, but then the structural failure of your own body begins. She leaned in closer to the glass. I'm an engineer. I don't need to break your bones. I just need to change your environment. Jin Ho's bravado began to flicker as he clutched his ears, his face reddening. I'm not a torturer. I'm an engineer. And right now, you are a faulty component in a high-pressure system. I know it's your people causing the rising temperatures at Pod 3 in the Gulf of Guinea. Who gave you the override codes? Is there a ghost in Seoul I haven't met yet? She pushed the pressure to 90 psi. Inside, Jin Ho was gasping, his chest heaving against the structural resistance of the compressed air. The physical weight of the atmosphere was literally crushing the secrets out of him. Stop, he wheezed, his voice high-pitched and distorted by the dense air. It's board member Park. I gave the codes to the Opal Architect, a private AI firm. They bought the board. They want the world to go dark, to disrupt the internet. Why? Kelechi asked. Must you even ask? You must be the dumbest engineer I know. Jin Ho spat back. Play nice, Kelechi said, her hand hovering back over the valve.
"3 things," Jinho shouted in a panic. "First, when the internet fails, critical systems fail over to insecure legacy lines, analog radio, and unencrypted channels. The architect is set up to intercept banking override codes that are usually buried under modern encryption. They're going after the central banks." Keep going. "The stock markets. If the internet blacks out for 10 minutes, the algorithms go into a tailspin. Opal Architect knows exactly when the blackout starts and ends. They'll short certain stocks and currencies right before the drop. When the lights come back on, they'll have netted billions in the gap." He gasped for air, his face turning a deep purple. "And the MFA, they've stolen the credentials of high-net-worth targets. During a blackout, multi-factor services are down. They'll use a localized intranet to bypass the security checks. The systems will default to a recovery mode that lets them right in." "A grand heist," Kelechi marveled. "You create the static so the world's circuit breakers pop. While the engineers are busy resetting the breakers, you're the only ones in the room who brought flashlights. You're printing your own money." She watched the gauge. The Opal Architect. It wasn't a gang war. It was a hostile corporate takeover of reality. "One more thing," she whispered. "How do I shut down the servers?" "In Ajaokuta, Kogi State." "Here in Nigeria?" Kelechi blurted in shock. "Yes," Jinho sobbed. "No agency expects a high-tech server farm in a dusty town on the banks of the Niger. They're hidden in plain sight in the basement of a run-down foundry called Future Steel. Level 4. There's an old safe door. Behind it, a physical fuse. Pull the fuse and the servers die. Please vent the tank." "Security?" "Minimal. Local recruits to avoid attention. The servers are worked remotely from Incheon. Please, I can't breathe." Kelechi reached for the release valve. She didn't want him dead, but he wouldn't be walking away easily. She picked up her phone, which had been recording the entire confession. She sent the file to the chairman's private number, followed by her location. "Some people will come to open the door for you," she said, her voice echoing in the hollow shipyard as she walked away. "I have a plane to catch." Upon leaving the shipyard, Kelechi moved with the mechanical efficiency of a clock spring. She knew the math. In 5 hours or less, Deep Sea Pod 3 would become a pressurized aquarium. The road from Lagos to Ajaokuta was a 9-hour gauntlet she couldn't afford time-wise. She didn't hesitate. Leveraging the Syndicate's deep-pocketed emergency funds, she secured an AW-169 helicopter from OAS Helicopter Leasing and Charter Services. In minutes, she was airborne, the sleek machine tearing through the humid Nigerian sky at its 300-kilometer-per-hour limit. Less than 2 hours later, the helicopter flared over an open field in Kogi State, kicking up red dust just a mile from her target. The Future Steel Ajaokuta Foundry didn't look like a high-tech fortress. It looked like a titan's tomb. It was a sprawling, soot-stained relic of an industrial dream that had never fully woken up, a place where iron was meant to be birthed in fire, now reduced to a skeleton of minimal production. But beneath the surface, it was the zero point for the global economy. Kelechi moved through the steam-choked corridors of Level 4, her presence masked by a stolen technician's jumpsuit and the bone-shaking thud of ancient hydraulic hammers operating on the floors above. She wasn't carrying a hacking deck. She carried a leather roll of specialized wrenches and a small bag with a can of industrial penetrant and a small Dewar flask of liquid nitrogen. "Level 4 secured," a voice crackled over the facility's comms. Kelechi pressed herself against a rusted structural pillar. A patrol of relaxed men carrying matte black rifles passed her position. They were looking for digital intruders, not a millwright in the shadows. They didn't expect trouble from the hardware. She reached the vault. It was a mechanical masterpiece from the 1950s, a massive triple-reduction gear lock, a physical three-point system that laughed at code. "You can't hack a physical gear ratio," Kelechi whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. She knelt at the base of the door. The master key wasn't a thumb drive, it was a mechanical fuse, a high-purity gallium alloy rod that acted as the physical bridge for the Opal Architect's primary data trunk. If the rod was removed, the entire network would fail-safe into a permanent offline state. Kelechi forced a flathead driver through a gap in the old door casing, using it as a lever to open a small gap and spray the industrial penetrant directly onto the primary drive gear. She pulled the handle lightly, listening to the metal. She felt the micro-vibrations of gears groaning under decades of tension. Using a long-handled torque wrench, she applied pressure, not to the lock, but to the counterweight assembly. Crack! The sound was no louder than a snapping twig. The gears began a slow, majestic rotation of teeth and grease. As the vault door ground open, a blast of chilled air hit her. In the center of the room, encased in a vacuum-sealed glass housing, sat the fuse. It pulsed with a sickly blue light, the heartbeat of the architect's connectivity. Suddenly, the lights shifted to a predatory red. "Room temperature tolerance exceeded," a synthesized voice droned. Kelechi didn't wait for the general alarm. She opened the Dewar flask and poured the liquid nitrogen directly onto the armored glass. The extreme thermal shock turned the tempered casing into a fragile lattice. "Data needs a host," she wheezed, the frost breath clouding her vision. She struck the frozen glass with her wrench. It fractured into 1,000 harmless pieces, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic thud of the hammers above. "And a host is just a machine. Machines have limits." Sliding on a heavy leather glove, she grabbed the glowing gallium rod. "And I'm an engineer. I know exactly when to shut the engine down." She yanked the fuse. The silence that followed in the adjacent server farm was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of a room. It was the quiet of a dead civilization. The red lights flickered once and died, leaving Kelechi in a tomb of cooling steel. Across the globe, in the boardrooms of the Opal Architect, there was now only pandemonium. The data was there, but what they didn't know was the bridge, the physical connector that allowed them to manipulate the world, was sitting in Kelechi's palm. "Pod 3 will be cooling down by now," she thought to herself. She exited as quietly as she had arrived. Once outside, she sent her coordinates to the chairman with a single final message. "Opal Server Farm, Level 4, disabled but intact. Neutralize soonest." She pressed send button and breathed in the dusty Ajaokuta air. Finally, the audit was closed. The clearance was 0.
In the gilded underworld, it was quiet at last. It wasn't peaceful, it was just quiet, suspiciously quiet, like the quiet before a storm.